Thank you for joining me this afternoon. Today we're going to be in Daniel chapter 1. Our suggested memory verse this week is Psalms 1:1. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. And if you enjoy this, remember to like and subscribe and share. And as always, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. Well, we're going to be in Daniel chapter 1, but in order to go there, we're going to have to back up a little bit. We're going to have to back up until the days of Solomon. Now, remember, Solomon was king of Israel, and one day the Lord appeared unto Solomon in a dream and asked him what he wanted. And remember, Solomon asked for wisdom. And so the Lord gave him wisdom, but he also gave him great wealth. And he was considered the wisest and the richest king of all times. But Solomon had a lot of wives. And the wives turned Solomon's heart away from the Lord. And here in 1 Kings chapter 11, starting just a second. 1 Kings 11, starting in verse 9, it says, And the Lord was angry with Solomon, because his heart was turned from the Lord God of Israel, which had appeared unto him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he kept not that which the Lord commanded. Wherefore the Lord said unto Solomon, For as much as this is done of thee, and thou hast not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded thee, I will surely rend the kingdom from thee, and give it to thy servant. Howbeit, I will not rend away all the kingdom, but will give one tribe to thy son, for David thy servant's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, which I have chosen. Now, if you remember, David followed the Lord with all his heart. And so he's telling Solomon, I'm not going to take the whole kingdom away from you. I will let you keep one tribe just for David's sake. Notwithstanding, in thy days I will not do it for David thy father's sake, but I will rend it out of the hand of thy son. And so Solomon passes away. He has a son named Rehoboam. And going to 1 Kings chapter 12, and I'm just going to read a few verses from this chapter. It says, And Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel will come to Shechem to make him king. And the people are talking to Rehoboam, and they said, Thy father made our yoke grievous. Now therefore, make thou the grievous service of thy father, and his heavy yoke, which he put upon us, lighter, and we'll serve thee. And Rehoboam responds unto them, and he spake to them after the counsel of the young man, saying, Thy father, my father, made your yoke heavy, and I will add to your yoke. My father also chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. And this is saying the children of Israel, which dwelt in the cities of Judah, Rehoboam reigned over them. So Rehoboam's only king over the tribe of Judah. And it came to pass, when all Israel heard that Jeroboam was come again, that they sent and called him unto the congregation, and made him king over all Israel. There was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. So 11 tribes followed Jeroboam, and only one tribe followed Rehoboam. So the kingdom is split right now. Well, to make a long story short, both kingdoms, Israel and Judah, turned from following the Lord. So in 722 BC, Assyria conquers the northern kingdom and it's destroyed. So now we go to Daniel chapter 1. And, well, I'll just start here. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem to seize it. Now, Jehoiakim, like it says, here's the king of Judah. He's placed on the throne by the Pharaoh of Egypt. His name means Yahweh raises up, but God didn't put him in as king. Pharaoh did. But anyway, it says Nebuchadnezzar went in and he besieged it around 605 BC. So around 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, he invades Jerusalem. The people stopped following the Lord, so God let Babylon invade them. And they took several people captive, and some of those captives were Daniel and his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were taken captives. And King Nebuchadnezzar orders them to pay tribute. And so we go to verse 2, and it says, And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. So it talks about Jehoiakim. He's the king of Judah. His father's name was Josiah. Remember, Josiah was a good king. He's the one that ordered the house of the Lord repaired. And while they were repairing it, they found the book of the law. And Josiah realized how far they had went away from the Lord. But Josiah was a good king. He followed the Lord. But Jehoiakim was not a good king. He turned away from the Lord. He was rebellious. You know, they were unfaithful to God. And this says, God, the Lord gave them. God let him be captured because of his wickedness. So God is punishing Jerusalem. He's punishing Judah. And right here it says the vessels. It says, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God. Now the vessels, remember, these are used in holy worship. You know, these are used in sacrifices. So the vessels represent God's holiness and worship. But you'll see in here where it says he gave them part of the vessels. So God didn't let them have all the vessels. So they were able to keep enough where they could keep their temple operations, but enough to show that Babylon had power over them. And the last 3 words of this verse are of his God. It says he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And this is talking about Nebuchadnezzar's God, and which is Marduk. This says that, you know, the Babylonians thought their God was greater than God. So they're mocking God. They're mocking God right here. And then we go to verse 3. And it says, And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes. So Ashpenaz was given great power within the king's palace. You know, he's responsible for these Jewish captives. And it says that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes. So in other words, they captured who they considered to be the smartest, richest, and wisest of all Jerusalem. And the ones that they're capturing, these captives are teenagers. They're probably anywhere from 10 to about 17 years old. So they're pretty young. Then we go to verse 4. And it's talking about, you know, what kind of people they're taking captive. It says, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom and cunning and knowledge and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. So they only wanted the ones that looked the best, that there was no defects. They wanted the best looking. the best, the healthiest. And it says, and skillful in all wisdom. So he chose the ones he felt were more competent, able to be taught, the best of the best, the top of their class, the ones with the highest IQs in all the land. And verse 5 says, and the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. So I look at that, the king's meat. You think about it. What would the king eat? The king's meat, so it's saying the best food in the land. He's offering them the best food of the land. They would be well fed. They're given the finest wine. So they're given the same food that was offered to the king. And here it says that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. And I was, you think about who's allowed to stand before the king. Not everybody. Not just anybody can go stand before a king. So, this is a great honor. They're going to get special training, the best training in all the land. They're going to get the best education. They're going to be taught the Babylonian language and culture. So they're being re-educated. So they're trying to indoctrinate these teenagers, these young kids, into being less Hebrew and more Babylonian. So they were treated very well. And I think of that stand before the king. I know that means physically, but I don't think it doesn't only mean physically. It means, mentally too. They're ready, they're prepared. And it says, okay, verse 6. Now among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. For he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah, Shadrach, and to Mishael, Meshach, and unto Azariah, Abednego. So the prince of the eunuchs changes their names. The name Daniel means God is my judge, but it was changed to Belshazzar, which means Bel's prince, or Bel protect the king. The name Hananiah means beloved by the Lord, but it was changed to Shadrach, meaning I fear a God. The name Mishael, meaning who is as God, was changed to Meshach, which means guest of a king. The name Azariah, meaning the Lord is my help, was changed to Abednego, meaning servant of Nebo, the son of Marduk. These are the only 4 that were mentioned by name. We see here that the king is trying to change their identity. He's trying to change their God. He's trying to change their customs. He's trying to change their language. He's trying to change everything about them. They're being totally taught Babylonian custom and culture. And this says, remember, they're from Judah. You think of Judah. Judah was the 4th son of Jacob and Leah. David was from the tribe of Judah. Jerusalem was located in Judah. The temple is located in Judah. It's located in Jerusalem. Who else is from the tribe of Judah? We know Jesus was from the tribe of Judah. Okay, so we go to verse 8. And verse 8 says, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now I was looking at that word purposed. Daniel purposed. Purposed means he made up his mind. Purpose is your intentions, your goal. Daniel made up his mind he wasn't going to compromise. Daniel chose to stay faithful to God. And And it says, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. So what does defile mean? Defile means to make dirty or unclean, to pollute, to taint. Daniel and his friends considered the king's food and wine defiled. There's several suggestions. Maybe it was because what they were eating was not according to Jewish law. Maybe they didn't remove the fat or the blood. Maybe it was sacrificed to idols because they didn't serve God. They served this Marduk. Maybe eating the king's food implied fellowship with Babylon's cultural system. But whatever it was, he felt like he was disobeying God's law. Now the king is also trying to change their food. It's another step into making them less Jewish or less Hebrew. And we go to verse 9. Now God had brought favor. Now let's try that again. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. So I was thinking of that. Tender love and favor. If you read between the lines here, this says a lot about Daniel. This says a lot about Daniel's character. Daniel must have been respectful. He must have been polite. He must have been courteous. Because if Daniel would have been rude, the eunuch wouldn't have listened to him. And it says here that God gave him favor with the eunuch. So I think this says a lot about Daniel's countenance, his verse 10. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then ye shall make me endanger my head to the king. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Okay, so Melzar is the prince of the eunuchs. He was in charge of these men. What happens when you disobey a king? He could get in a lot of trouble. He could be executed. It was his responsibility to make sure that these men were trained and fed. These men were his responsibility. They were his top priority. The king trusted him. He said, you go before the king and you're not as healthy as everyone else. I'm in a lot of trouble. But he respected Daniel. And here I think, Daniel knew the law. He knew the consequences. The king's the one that ordered the menu. They could have been severely punished for disobeying the king. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar could be cruel sometimes. For example, right here in Jeremiah 39:6, then the king of Babylon slew the sons of Zedekiah in Riblah before his eyes, and the king of Babylon slew all the nobles of Judah. Moreover, he put out Zedekiah's eyes and bound him with chains to carry him to Babylon. This just shows how cruel he could be. So he knew what the king was capable of. He knew what the consequences could be. So Daniel, he's talking to the prince of the eunuchs. He's talking to Melzar. And he says, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days. Let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat. And as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So Daniel says, test us. Right now Daniel's putting God to the test. Daniel trusted in God, and he let God fight the battle. Daniel agreed to eat vegetables and water for 10 days, and afterwards, you can check us. You be the judge. See what you think. And I look at that number 10. He says 10 days. 10 in the Bible means trial or testing. You think about it, there were 10 plagues, there were 10 virgins. There's 10 commandments. It means testing or trials. We go to verse 14. In verse 14 it says, "So he consented," and this is Melzar. "He consented to them in this matter, and proved them 10 days." So he agreed to give Daniel a chance. And the only way this could happen is if God intervened. God was fighting for Daniel. We go to verse 15, and it says, "At the end of the 10 days, their countenances appeared fair and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat." You look at that fair and fatter, they were healthier. They were healthier. God gave them favor. And I think about it. It says, "Then all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat." Okay, who were all the children? Where'd these children come from? Many, if not all of them, were from Jerusalem. They're all Jews. All of them should have been protesting. It shouldn't have just been Daniel and his 3 friends. They were all raised in Jewish law. They were all from Jerusalem. But everyone else compromised. These 4 teenagers were the only ones, at least the only ones mentioned, that stayed true to God and his laws. And I was thinking about that. You look at Psalms, and Psalm says, "Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper." God says, if we stand true to God, he'll fight for us. And I look at this. At the end of the 10 days, their countenances were 10 times better than everyone else. Remember Joseph? God made everything Joseph did to prosper. Joseph was sold as a slave, and what did God do? God put him in charge of all the other slaves. God was thrown into prison, and what did God do? He promoted him and put him in charge of all the other prisoners. And then Pharaoh had a dream, and what do you know it? Joseph is set free and made second in command, of all Egypt. If we fight for God, he'll fight for us. We go to verse 16. "Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse." So he didn't make them eat this anymore. He let Daniel eat what he felt like he was supposed to eat. And then we go to verse 17, and it says, "As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge." He's talking about Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. "God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm." Look how God rewarded them. He gave them knowledge. He gave them skill. He gave them wisdom. Where does wisdom come from? Wisdom comes from God. This shows God's blessing them richly because of their faithfulness. He gave Daniel understanding of visions and dreams. They were 10 times wiser than everyone else. In James, it says, "If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him." Okay, and then we go to verse 21. "And David continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus." Okay, well, getting back to history real quick, we talked about how Nebuchadnezzar invaded Jerusalem. Well, 5 years after he invaded it the first time, he goes. Now, this has been at least 3 years because they were in training for 3 years. Okay, so not too long after this, Nebuchadnezzar goes back into Jerusalem and invades it again because they're not paying tribute. And this time he takes 10,000 more captives from Judah. And this time when he goes, he takes Ezekiel. Ezekiel's one of the ones that were taken. He was about 25 years old. Now, Jeremiah was at this time too. Jeremiah wasn't taken. He remained in Jerusalem. But he was at this time too. And I believe he's older than Ezekiel. So you have Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And all of they're all right around the same time. And I want to say thank you for watching this today. I have some review questions. I'll let you look at these questions real quick, and then I'll give you the answers. And thank you so much for joining me today.